This is Test Case Scenario with me, your host, Jason Baum. This podcast is the definitive hub for knowledge and stories in the software testing and development communities. If you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button and let's dive straight into the episode. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Test Case Scenario. I am your host, Jason Baum, and with me as always, Evelyn Coleman, Marcus Merrill, and Nikolay Evelyn. We got a full house today. Everybody on the panel. Welcome back, all.
Hey.
Good to be here. Glad to be back.
Awesome. You sound so excited. We're going to get even more excited as we keep going. You'll have noticed, or you might have noticed, perhaps you didn't notice. I don't know how you wouldn't have noticed. We have a special guest today. Our special guest is Ross Radford. Ross, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jason. Thank you all for having me.
Awesome. And Ross is an enterprise software leader and lifelong testing advocate, currently writing a book for technology leaders, Software Testing for Managers, due out in March from A-Press. And Ross, you are a director of software engineering, I should throw in there as well.
That's a great intro. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here.
It was almost as if you wrote it yourself. Ross, really appreciate you coming on. We're excited to talk to you about the concept of the book, which is like software testing for managers. So first of all, tell us a bit about yourself. How did you get into software testing? And then we can kind of go on to the theme of the episode.
I've been making websites since I was a little kid back in the 90s, but it took a while for it to click that every single time I wrote a piece of code, I was also testing it. So doing a manual test or later doing automated tests, it's always been something that's there, but it took me a while to realize how important it was and to get that into like a natural workflow in my professional work. And I think it's something that gets underlooked in management too. I've had managers approach me who are building software systems for their whole careers and not really getting serious about testing. So I wanted to reach out and bridge that gap.
Nice. Yeah, as a kid of the 80s and early 90s, I felt like there was like two ways you could go when the internet kind of got here, the dial up. It was like you could go the way that you went, or you could go the way that I went, which was like making prank phone calls over dial up.
Yeah, exactly.
Or you could do both.
You could do both. Did you do both, Nikolay?
I did both. Yes.
Oh, good for you. Good for you.
Ross, did you have a specific moment as you were building these websites and learning that test automation was really important for you? Was there a thing that broke that gave you that like wake up call, or?
I think really it was not quite as dramatic as that, but my first real paid gig doing code was building automated tests. That was driven by an enterprise customer and a friend of mine who was helping me get started. And he was just like, we have big production bugs and they break things. So here's the value proposition. It's a good place for you to get started in your career. And in a lot of ways, it's just always been there with me, right? So taking that into my professional life, it's saved so many hours of quality rundowns of production bugs, and just seeing the value from the very beginning has always been something that stuck with me. Yeah, but I do remember one time in particular. So I spent the last 10 years working at Experian, the credit bureau, and we were doing a big integration with the state of South Carolina, and they had a big data breach, and Experian does a lot of data breach remediation. And so we're working on this integration with their data services to do this big complicated thing. And I remember part of that is an identification, like a consumer identification application. So it would do this thing that we've probably all done where you list things like the first car that you ever had or your home address when you're a kid or whatever, sometimes called out of wallet identification. And the questions that the state was sending to us were through their API, and we didn't have any reference at all about what they would be. And dealing with government bureaucracy, you can go back and forth, wait for them to give you some kind of specification, and it's just going to take months. And we were really under a lot of pressure to keep going. So what we ended up doing is automating a API response that would just continue. And these questions are generated randomly, right? we knew there'd be a limited set. So we just set it up an automated feedback loop to just record all the possible questions that they would send us so we could get a format of them, just populated a database, and took a few hours to do that. But that was one of the times where I was just like, we could have been waiting for weeks for them to get back to us on a spec for that. But having all that data made it possible to test through their system, anticipating the questions they were going to ask. So that was a big moment that I can remember.
That's great.
I think your story is cool in that it shows a not often talked about the value of automation, which is doing automation outside of the actual application that you're just working on. Many people just think of like, okay, I'm going to do automation. I'm only going to try to automate the stuff on the app that I'm working on. But there are separate processes that involve you doing your day-to-day that you can automate as well. And actually, your story, Ross, made me remember a story that I had at one of my first jobs doing automated testing. I was doing the typical black box automated end-to-end UI automation, which was going horribly. It was the worst, most expensive code I've ever written. And I feel bad, but it's part of life. But a value that I created was manual testers needed to fill out an Excel spreadsheet with different kinds of data that they would then upload to our application. And based on that, the application had to behave accordingly. And these we had, I don't know, I want to say 20, 30 manual testers doing this all the time. And it required tons of permutations of different kinds of data. We created a macro script that would fill out information based on parameters that they would email us. And based on that, we would fill out and create these spreadsheets. And we would be churning them out all day, every day for these manual testers. And that it was so valuable. Everybody loved it. And I thought, very valuable.
Those test fixtures, I think that's super common issue. The idea of having different data sets that get emailed around or whatever. That's a special section in my book where I talk about automating that because super common pattern, like you say. Yeah, a lot of people need that.
That's awesome. On that topic, with both of you having had these stories where you save time using automation, which then could go on to save your clients time, not in Nikolay's case because he wrote very expensive code, but save your clients time, help automate their tests, and then save them from bugs. How do you make sure that you get credit for that, given that some folks might not even realize you spent that time doing automation? They might just say, well, Ross and Nikolay have lots of extra free time on their hands.
Right. Yeah, I think it's super important to communicate with leadership and explain that value. Make sure they're on the same page. It's one of the reasons I wanted to write a book about it. That's a huge theme in all of my work. Leadership needs to know because they need to allocate resources, right? They need to be the ones who are setting the time and the money for that work, and they need to see the value in it. So it's super important.
So that's great because now we're on the topic of the book. I want to know, like, A, what was the inspiration to write a book like this? And then B, how do you tell your boss something like that? Like, how do you talk to your boss?
The book is kind of reaching out to the managers directly, right? Yeah, if you're an engineer and you're trying to talk to your boss about this stuff, testing is a big agile principle. Talk to your project manager, but I find that they know that, you can't have bugs in production. You can't have regression all the time. It's an easy sell once you say we can prevent that. Then you just need to demonstrate that you actually know how to do it. And I think testing also tends to be looked at as kind of a cost center in some ways. I'm trying to propose that we're like, oh, we're going to go off and write a bunch of new code that's going to protect the other code. And then your manager's like, that sounds expensive. That's something you need to be able to talk through because I do think there's a perception that a lot of out of control development on test code can be expensive and maybe even not worthwhile. And I think there's some truth to that. It can get out of control if you're not careful. But the reason that I wanted to write this book is because I had an executive friend, and I talk about this, I think it's in the first chapter, who called me up, panicked, because they had a huge contract. And, they were doing essentially contract negotiations between two big vendors for state governments. And what they had to do was provide UAT testing. So user acceptance testing is part of the contractual requirement, which meant that they had to, no experience, open an entire department of UAT testers to try to test this software system that was being built as a independent third-party audit. And so they're panicked and they're just like, I don't know anything about testing. And a few weeks of talking through that with my friend and getting them up to speed just gave me the idea, man, I can crystallize some of this information and make it more accessible for people.
That's awesome.
Can I touch on one topic I heard you mention, Ross, that I feel like is a misconception in the industry that leads to a lot of challenges that we have around automated testing, and that is that you can't have bugs in production. I don't agree with that. I think you can have bugs in production, and we have to get out of the mindset that bugs should not make it to production, and the mindset of prevention. Instead, I think if bugs do make it to production, it's okay. Make sure you can fix them quickly and make sure that they aren't serious. So, like Marcus has talked about this before, where, if you're like a bank and you're very sticky to your customer, if you have some, I don't know, visual flaws in your web app, your customers aren't going to leave you because they're stuck with your service, And so it's okay to have those, fix them. It's not the end of the world if they make it there. But if you're not able to transfer money, that's a much more horrendous bug that should not make it to production. And that's where I would focus my effort. What do you think, Ross and Marcus?
Acceptable risk for certain kinds of bugs.
Yeah, I was talking to a customer directly yesterday. They were talking about how they label all their tests priority 1 to priority 4, and they run them all together. And I'm like, okay, so what's the real chance that if a priority 4 test fails, you're going to stop the release, fix the bug? Like, if it's priority 4, there's a good chance that you're just going to put it on the backlog and fix it in 6 months. So don't let it fail to build.
Right.
Be very judicious about what you allow in your pipeline in order to gate whether or not the build is passed. The other thing it reminds me of is just that I've spent a lot of time in my career testing a lot of silly stuff, priority 4 stuff, and missing the top priority stuff because I was told to give it 100% code coverage. And it just reminds me of I don't know if you know the story of I think it's California Forestry Service. For nearly 100 years, the rule was put out every fire by 10 a.m. Every single fire has to be out by 10 a.m. They did that for 80 years, and now fires are uncontrollable because fire wasn't allowed to do its job of clearing out underbrush for so long that now every fire is catastrophic. And I'm not sure that metaphor tracks. It feels like the right metaphor.
Marcus has this uncanny ability to have a metaphor for literally everything. Even the forestry service. So now we've gone the forestry route. Marcus likes cars, forestry. What other things do you compare things to?
Can we do an episode where Marcus just tells us all his metaphors?
All the metaphors. Yes, we're going to do 100 metaphors for our 100th episode.
Yes.
Oklahoma registry for criminals.
We have to guess what it's a metaphor for, but like within testing.
Oh, start with the metaphor, like Karnak.
I like that. That's great.
Not like Jeopardy.
I don't want to take us too far away from like the main topic, but I do want to point out, because I was also on the episode when we had Mac on and we were talking about gaming, that there's a difference between letting low priority bugs go as opposed to intentionally releasing something early with bugs and then patching it later, as we are starting to see in the game industry. And as a budding gamer, I am starting to become aware of. So I do want to say that those are separate things. Something might be priority 4, but low priority doesn't mean skipped intentionally necessarily. Sometimes it can if there's resource constraints.
It's like, are you going to hold the build, hold the presses, stop the release from going out or not? If you are not, then you still run the test. You just don't, like, it's just in a different pipeline.
So how do you tell your boss, hey, we're going to release this? It's got a few bugs in it, but we're going to release it anyway. So how do you communicate that? So like we said, the one way, right, of, well, you want to stop all the bugs, but then how do you tell your boss, yeah, it's got bugs?
I mean, just like that, you got to be honest, right? Get them used to it, exposure it.
But you need to talk about risk at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw that already on your website, the ERA test coverage concept. I mean, it's all about risk.
Right. It's super important. And I think that's part of that conversation of talking to your boss about making test a priority, you have to be like, there's levels of priority, right? So we're not going to, like you say, like fall into the trap of 100% code coverage. I think that's a big topic. I mean, I know it's so common. I've heard that so many times.
What does that mean for our audience? Just we'll define it and then
It's like an ideal, right? It's like you can measure code coverage. So then the next logical step is like, we should have as much of that as possible. There's so many reasons that it's essentially unachievable that if you get stuck on it, or like we were saying, like don't prioritize certain tests, that can be a problem too. I mean, code coverage is one thing, and then test coverage is the other, right? So you could be covering each line of code with a unit test or whatever it is that you're doing. You could also be defining test scenarios and then having a measure of coverage for each one of those. So you could be striving towards 100% coverage no matter what. One point that I always bring up though is that if your tests are breaking and they're doing their job because they're finding bugs and they're breaking, the ideal is to go in and fix that bug immediately. But the bug, really what's going to happen is it's going to get prioritized, it's going to get triaged. Maybe it's a lower priority. And while that bug is still being worked on, that whole test, that section of the test suite is going to be out of commission and not providing coverage. And so you're doing work that needs to be done. I don't think there's any way to avoid that. So you cannot have 100% test coverage all the time. It's just not realistic unless you're never finding any bugs.
So do you recommend something like a quarantine system, or how would you set those tests aside for a little while?
I mean, yeah, and so the way I would do it is you mark them as skipped or ignored in your code base, depending on what's wrong with it. If it's an issue that needs high priority, then jump on it and everybody knows about it. But the way that you measure coverage should maybe not take into account the stuff that's intentionally being skipped or ignored. Maybe that's a little bit too far down the rabbit hole for a lot of people with test coverage, but I care about that stuff deeply.
Well, to me, the important thing is that there's this one metric that people have latched onto. Why? Because you can measure it objectively, or so they think, if you define what it means properly. The thing about it is that it goes from being the only metric that we can actually hang on to becoming a trophy that the CTO gets to put on their desk and say, hey, look what we got. When in fact, it's a very incomplete way of measuring what you're trying to accomplish. You talk about that a little bit more around your ERA coverage model?
Yeah, so that ERA coverage is, it's an advanced code coverage idea, and I don't actually put that in the book that much because it's a little bit kind of more esoteric. But yeah, it's like I was saying, just in plain English, if your tests aren't breaking, they're not catching bugs. And if they are breaking, then you don't have full coverage. It's that simple, right? So it's like striving for this metric also can lead to, I don't want to say worthless, but low quality tests. The classic like assert true, right? You could just you could be a lazy coder and you could code a test that just always passes pretty easily if you want to.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you're a coder and you're an individual engineer, and you're under a lot of time pressure, I mean, like stuff like that could start to happen, especially if testing isn't given its own time. So I think on the project management level, it's extremely important to have time allocated into each development task for testing. Maybe there's already tests, you don't need to do that or whatever, but it needs to be considered because otherwise you get these weird effects like low value tests, just testing for trying to hit this metric of code coverage or whatever. So yeah, that's part of the conversation I want to have. I want to tell every boss, look out.
what is the most outrageous bug that you've ever found? And then how did you communicate that to your boss?
It depends, like outrageous, like super complex bugs that to me, I'm like, we're working on an old deprecated version of Angular for whatever reason. It's so deprecated that it's not in the official repository anymore. So we have our own artifact that we've been like hacking together on this super old legacy project. This is a real example. And it's just like, why is anybody working on this? And of course, there's bugs all over the place. And you're just like, oh, geez, what a mess. And then you have to like try to get somebody to help you try to explain the history of why this happened. And that's the most ridiculous one. But I think the most rigorous ones, the ones that really shock me, are the ones that I started to encounter when I started doing static code analysis and security testing. Like the first time you see like just an actual password that's in line in some code somewhere, it's like, what? That's the kind of thing that'll make you spit your coffee out.
That's hilarious. I have this thing that I can't get out of my mind when you were talking about whether or not tests are like being maintained. It just reminded me so much of this method that people use for their closets. And you said skip tests, that some people every year will turn all of their hangers backwards in their closet. So essentially that would be the metaphor of like skipping every single test. And then when they wear something, they put it away with the hanger facing the correct way. And at the end of the year, anything that hasn't been turned around, meaning it hasn't been worn, gets donated or thrown out. And it cannot stop. You're talking, and I'm like, do that with tests.
I love that.
Who here has heard of that before?
I have not.
Yes, Nikolay.
Because I saw Nikolay.
I'm already a believer.
I have never heard of that before.
Oh, yeah, I'm absolutely going to do that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Great idea.
With your clothing and your test.
Isn't that mutation testing? Mutation testing is testing your tests. So what it does is there are systems designed in package you can install that will reverse the conditions of your automated test. And so if you're like asserting that something is true, I guess it will reverse it to assert that it is false, and it'll check whether it had the expected behavior. And if it didn't, you know that people are cheating the tests.
Oh, that's fascinating. I think you should do that as well. But I think what I'm talking about is like you normally run like 100% of your tests, right? You have 100% code coverage and you run all these tests every single day, every time somebody pushes their code. But what if you set them all to skip and then you only turn them back on when there was a bug or some kind of regression that forced you to run that would have been caught if that test had been run. And then at the end of the year, you see which tests actually managed to catch something and which tests didn't. And then you can decide to throw some out or rewrite some. But I think you do this in combination with what Nikolay said, especially for those priority 4 tests.
Right.
4, that's so low.
I love the idea of like trying to eliminate tests that are just not worthless or not effective. I think it's always a big red flag if you have a test or a testing section of your suite that just never breaks, never throws errors. Like what? Like maybe take a look, see what's going on.
Donate those tests to the
We
thrift
talk
store.
about that a lot on this show. Yeah.
I probably told the story a couple times now about how I once had a suite of 800 tests where the site was down, but the tests ran and 23 of them still passed. I mean,
Yep. There you go.
I had some explaining to do that day.
Nikolay, I have so many questions. Nikolay, on your topic about the mutation testing though, like Ross was saying, it can be so hard to convince your manager that you should invest a bunch of time writing more code to make sure that your code works. But now you're talking one level more meta than that, which is you've written something that tests your tests, which tests the code. How do you market that to your manager? Holy heck.
And then how do you test the test tester?
Today, there's something going on today because this is so meta right now. I'm glad you said that, Evelyn. The testing, and test the tester.
No. I was totally joking about that part. I was just creating confusion.
I just came from a call where I learned that in Asana, you could have a subtopic of a subtopic. Now, what's a subtopic? Is that a subtopic? Like my head is blown today.
I'm so sorry, but I had a genuine that was a genuine question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
For all of these, my main question is, can we make sure at the end of the usage of this tool that we can make some sort of statement about the quality of our product and how it was affected by this exercise? Because I do agree that targeted fault assertion is targeted fault insertion is actually a different thing. Mutation testing is a good practice, but I want at the end of it to have an outcome that's like, and now we can make an even better statement about the quality of our product. Not just, you can still have shitty tests that pass mutation testing with flying colors.
But doesn't this all go back to what Nikolay said, to what Ross was saying earlier about like, at the end of the day, you'll have something in prod that has bugs, and it's about not necessarily getting to net perfect, right? It's good enough, and then making those fixes, because you could test something where's the line? What's the line?
Right. There's the level of effort to go in, like Nikolay is saying, test your tests, try to do quality assurance on your testing itself. I think that stuff's important, but man, there's so many organizations that really aren't even doing the base level testing while you're writing code. There's a certain level of trust there too. Like it's possible that you can have engineers that are writing tests that suck that are just too easy to pass. That's possible, but there's a general level of trust that you have to have with the people you're working with, right?
It also includes product management. You could be doing great testing. It's a crappy product.
Yeah.
What I try to tell people is that their job in testing is not just to do coverage, all that stuff. Your job is to protect your company's brand, protect your user experience. Because there's a good chance the developer is way too overloaded getting requirements turned into code to really stop and wonder whether or not the product is the right product.
I really believe in specification testing. So product owners defining specifications of how the product should behave. I think that's super valuable because just like you say, like the average engineer, they're seeing one part of the code, especially for a bigger product. They're not getting into the nooks and crannies of every use case and thinking about the way that a user is going to be seeing it all the time. It's just too much information to take in for a lot of projects. So having specified defined behavior can be extremely important when it comes time for someone to test something that, they may not have an intuitive grasp of what this login form is supposed to do in this certain scenario or whatever. Those things need to be defined by the product owner, I think.
So we've covered so many ways that you could test, so many things that you can test. I have two questions. The first is not serious, and the second is a serious question. First question is, so last week was Valentine's Day. Have you ever dated a dating app? Wow.
Never dated it.
Now that I talk about meta, where this is the
Sounds
meta
confusing.
episode where it's
Have you ever dated your test?
that's an episode of Black Mirror. Have you ever have you
Have you
ever
ever loved the
tested
test so much that you took it on a date?
Forget it. I'm done. Have you ever tested a dating app? Okay, there's first question, not serious. Serious question is with all these ways of testing and all the things that you need to cover, how do you balance speed? Because you need to get things out quick. How do you balance that need for speed with all that too?
Yeah, I think like we were saying, having a level of acceptable risk, like to know where the priorities are. It's just really part of project management. Project manager has to be super involved in helping allocate time for testing. And sometimes that means that you don't test. Sometimes it means you don't write a test because maybe there's already is one or whatever. It's lower priority. I think that's really the answer there to keep on top of speed. I mean, you got to know where your acceptable risk is so you can ship as fast as you can, but with still some level of quality. Like, where is that? Everybody has to ask themselves that. I talk about that in the book too. It's super important.
I agree. And the challenge I always have with that is how do you quantify that? And I know it's so tough. And whenever I hear that, because you can have a warm, fuzzy feeling about the quality of your software, but I feel like managers, higher level people are always looking for a number to put on it and then move towards that number. Is there a way to quantify it?
Wait, I have input on this. I know I'm coming out from the blue and I'm not Ross, but if you're thinking about this stuff from the bottom up, I think it's really important that if your managers and leadership want you to quantify the quality of your software, they could start by telling you what the quality is now and providing you a baseline in some kind of number so that you can go off of that. I don't think it's necessarily fair for testers and software engineers to try to quantify something like the quality of the product overall or the app or the website overall if a metric for the quality at the moment hasn't been provided either. Sorry, that was just my 2 cents.
No, I agree with that. I think, these are an important conversation to have with all the stakeholders. So that'd probably be clients too, right? Or whoever your customers are. And each individual project or product might be more focused on UX experience. I know for some of the clients I was working with previously, quality is important. Functionality was pretty solid on our product. So they were very, very laser focused on pixel perfect design for their front end user experience. And I got to work on some of that fun visual comparison testing where you take screenshots of two versions of a website and then do an overlap comparison. And it only highlights the pixels that are like off for each one of them so we can catch design issues. That was a lot of fun to work on, but a big project just to write all that testing. It's a bunch of code. And I learned a lot writing those tests because they would break all the time. The code itself was hard to maintain. And my boss was like, we're only doing this because this one customer cares about this much, right? You got to know where the priorities are for the whole organization in some cases. I think that's a good example of providing the most value as a tester means going out and talking to everybody. Try to get into the room with a product owner if you can. Talk it up all the time. Reach out.
Really great advice. Thanks so much, Ross, for coming on the show today. The book is Software Testing for Managers. Look for it next month. And you could go to testfromthetop.com for more and to sign up for the book release announcement. Ross, really, really appreciate your time today coming out and having some fun with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, look for that book. We'll be looking for it. And we are so appreciative of your time. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Test Case Scenario. Thank you to the panel, Evelyn, Marcus, and Nikolay. And we will see you next time on Test Case Scenario. Thank you for joining us on Test Case Scenario. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'll make sure to respond to each and every single one. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to keep in touch. If you missed our last episode, it's popping up on your screen right now. Go, click it. Until next time on Test Case Scenario.